Thank you, Nick. The time has just turned 10 o'clock and we reflect today upon a woman who was on earth for 96 years and on the throne for 70, a life the like of which we will simply never see again. Whatever perspective you choose to view it from, the transformation that she witnessed and in many ways steered our nation through is and always will be unprecedented. Whether it's technology, whether it is the empire, the Commonwealth, the country, her own family's relationship with her public. It is 7 decades of absolutely indescribable importance. But it falls to us to try to do those descriptions, to foster those memories and to share those thoughts as we continue to commemorate and to mourn Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Time now for the news headlines with Simon Conway.
From Global's newsroom, a period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. Buckingham Palace has set out some details of the King's wishes following his mother's death at the age of 96. LBC's correspondent Rachel Venables, who's outside the palace, says it's not been confirmed yet when Her Majesty's funeral will be held.
Current estimates are around Monday the 19th of September, but it means that certainly for the next few weeks it will be very different behaviours from the royal family, certainly as they enter that official period of royal mourning. Throughout that time, we know that the flags at royal residences, so places like Buckingham Palace here, castles throughout the country, they will remain at half-mast.
Gun salutes will be fired at Hyde Park and the Tower of London at 1 o'clock, and at midday bells will toll at churches across the country, while MPs and peers will gather for a special sitting at Parliament so they can pay tribute to the Queen. Throughout the morning, thousands of people have continued to gather at royal residences, including Windsor Castle.
Remarkably emotional, really. Almost. I'm feeling more inside than when my father passed away.
We came here because we wanted to just put some flowers for the Queen, and she is very kind.
Of course, everyone's sad, but she had a fantastic life.
Messages have come in from world leaders, including US President Joe Biden, who called Her Majesty a source of comfort and pride for generations of Britons. Ukraine's President Zelensky also sent his condolences.
With deep sadness, I have learned of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. It's a heavy loss for the whole of Europe and the world. On behalf of all of Ukraine, I express sincere condolences to the royal family, the whole of the UK and the Commonwealth countries. Our thoughts and prayers are with you.
All 6 living former Prime Ministers of Britain have paid tribute to the Queen, including Sir Tony Blair, who says we have lost the matriarch of our nation.
The Queen's life has been a continual process of shaping how you keep in touch with a world that's changing very fast, but she was always doing that.
King Charles is due to return to London from Balmoral. His Majesty is expected to deliver a televised address this evening. A service of prayer and reflection on the death of the Queen will be held in St Paul's Cathedral at 6 p.m. The Prime Minister and the Lord Mayor of London are among the expected attendees. And today's weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, more persistent rain for parts of Scotland, a high of 21 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Simon Conway.
Thank you, Simon. 4 minutes after 10 is the time on Friday, September the 9th, 2022. And we come together this morning, of course, to commemorate an extraordinary life. The life of a woman who, in many ways, existed in tandem. There were, I think, 2 queens. There's the Queen that we all saw, but none of us knew. And then there was the Queen that we all had our own relationship with, the Queen that we all felt a connection to or an understanding of. And that, in many ways, I think, was her triumph. The fact that she managed to keep the 2 separate. You don't have the first idea about what went on when the doors were closed. I don't have the first idea about what she believed, what she thought, what her opinions were. Remarkable that in an age of opinion, an age of debate and performative argument, the most famous woman on the planet managed to keep almost all of her powder dry for her entire life, certainly for her entire reign. And that was her triumph. That, I think, was her secret, the way in which we all construct an image of who we think she was, and they are all images of equal validity. Today, I think, is a day for commemoration and coming together. It is a day for mourning, but also, of course, for celebrating. In recent months, Her Majesty has had the look of a woman who was exhausted, was tired. Her final duty, ushering in a new Prime Minister. And as we learned yesterday, her final public act. Here on LBC, we are acutely conscious both of the importance of the occasion and of the importance that the Queen would this morning herself afford to the thoughts of her subjects, to the myriad memories that people will hold, both personal and public, to the sense of loss, personal loss, remarkably, because almost everybody listening to this programme now and almost everybody who lives in this country and beyond will have felt a personal relationship with a woman that in most cases we never met, which is why I began by suggesting that we both knew her and didn't know her at all. We all have our own sense of who she was and what she meant to us, and yet none of us, unless, of course, there are some unexpected dignitaries tuning in this morning, but none of us could truly have the first notion of, I'm going to use a figure of speech, the first notion of what actually made her tick. The glimpses of her passion for racehorsing or her love for her corgis or her fondness for ancient Land Rovers, all added to this idea of a woman who, despite the pageantry that followed her wherever she stepped, maintained a love of mischief, a sense of fun. Some of the exchanges with her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, have gone down in history as remarkable examples of managing to somehow walk that tightrope between duty, between the formal requirements of office, and yet the little glimpses of personality that inevitably shone through endeared her to her subjects, to her nation, in ways that we may never see again, because that ability, that triumphant achievement, that retention of privacy, of discretion, that refusal to never let the light in is unique. And we already know more about the thoughts and the feelings of King Charles III than we ever will about the thoughts and feelings of his mother. But again, now is not the time for looking forward. Now is the time for recognising the moment, mourning the present, and commemorating the past. It's 8 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we will spend our time together this morning looking back upon some of the moments of Her Majesty's reign, some of the requirements of the period of mourning in which we now find ourselves. Almost unprecedented, of course, because very, very few of us were even alive the last time there was a changing of the monarch at Buckingham Palace. And so, as politicians, we'll be dusting off ancient tomes, instructing them on what the correct and required way to conduct proceedings is. So we will be learning every day for the next fortnight and quite possibly beyond, learning about what occurs in these instances, what unfolds at times such as this. I'm also going to invite you at some point this morning to share your own memories, your own particular experiences of interactions with Her Majesty the Queen, because that's what we always do. And although we now are in a time of unprecedented national importance, there is, of course, also a sense of something the Queen understood perhaps better than anybody, of the world continuing to turn, of life continuing to go on. And we come together every morning to share our thoughts, to share our experiences, our stories, and occasionally our opinions, although we may perhaps put them on pause for the foreseeable future. And today, in some ways, will be no different. It's an odd experience, sitting here, reflecting upon something that everybody knew must happen, everybody knew would happen, everybody knew will happen. And yet when it did, it felt as if something was shaken. People unexpectedly feeling a profundity that this occasion demands. People who perhaps felt they didn't have a particular interest in the monarchy or a particular interest in the Queen herself find themselves surprisingly shaken by the disruption to normality, the disruption to everything we've ever known. For anybody pretty much under the age of 75, your conscious life in this country has included the Queen, the quiet presence, the silent constant, the unending presence in our life is over. And it's weird to reflect upon just how completely her existence, her reign and her life, not to mention her office, is woven through every layer and every level of the United Kingdom and beyond. We will, of course, reflect today to parts of the world beyond these islands where Her Majesty remained and for now remains a figure of enormous importance, something that perhaps many of us who grew up here remain a little unaware of. Beyond the royal visits with which we're all familiar, the relationship, the loyalty, the depth of affection runs much deeper than we can appreciate for the fortnights when the television cameras accompany the royal family to far-flung climes. We'll be looking back upon some moments, some important moments of her reign and indeed of her life. Although, again, I come back to that dichotomy between the reign and the life, between the Queen as we knew her and the Queen as she was. Oh, what are there? 60 million of us in this country, although not everybody will be listening to this programme at this point in time, but that's probably 60 million different views, 60 million different perspectives. But reflect for a moment upon the transformation that unfolded while she remained that constant presence. The technological transformation. A world not just without internet, but pretty much without television when she ascended to the throne. Most sitting rooms would still have been relying upon the radio. You look upon the changes in the relationships between the monarch and the Commonwealth, what remained when she came to the throne of the empire. You look upon the changes in her family, in her relationship with the public, the moments of genuine peril, the annus horribilis, the times when it looked as if that history of royalty, that history of monarchy was under existential threat. And yet somehow she always conveyed a calmness, a quietness and a determination that I think, regardless of where you stand on the scale of enthusiasm for monarchy in general, the individual retained respect, retained admiration, and retained in many ways the love of an entire people. The time now is 10:13. I'm going to keep you completely up to speed with how things are going to develop on this programme today, a little different from normal. I'll be joined shortly by my colleague Lisa Aziz, who will be keeping me and you company throughout the morning until Sheila Fogarty returns to the microphone at about 1 o'clock today. We're going to take a news bulletin, certainly at 1:15 and 1:30 and 1:45 the hour in the first hour of the programme. The House of Commons is due to convene at 12 noon today. The intention at the moment is to cross live to hear the introductions from the Speaker and then the tributes from both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. We will stay there according to the import and the profundity of the occasion. And then a salute is due at 1 o'clock today, which we will also cross to live. I have colleagues, as you know, if you've been listening to LBC's extremely good and respectful coverage since yesterday afternoon. I have colleagues up and down the country to whom we will turn for descriptions of atmosphere and gatherings of people sharing in that sense of shock, albeit shock at the absolutely inevitable and shock at the expected. And a quick word for people perhaps who are a little excluded perhaps from proceedings, a little, if not baffled, then if not unmoved, then certainly not as engaged as everybody around you seems to be. Today is a day for recognising what we have in common, not just in the context of a monarchy or a country, but in the context of a population. As the royal family themselves set aside well-documented and deeply written divisions, so a country at a time like this becomes a family and mourns the passing of a matriarch. Hatchets must be buried for the time being. Arguments must be forgotten and disagreements and differences, at the very least, must be paused. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Simon Conway is here now with your headlines.
A period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral, in line with the King's wishes. Gun salutes to commemorate the Queen's life will be fired in central London this lunchtime, and bells will ring out at churches across the country. King Charles III is due to return to London from Balmoral. He will address the nation this evening, and a service of prayer and reflection on the death of the Queen will be held in St Paul's Cathedral at 6 p.m. LBC weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, a high of 21 degrees.
Thank you, Simon. 10:15 is the time. 70 years on the throne and 96 years on earth. My colleague Lisa Aziz joins me for the duration of the programme this morning, and I suppose we must begin, Lisa, by reflecting upon the fact that we could sit here for 48 hours, never mind 3, and not come close to acknowledging every moment of importance during this remarkable reign.
Absolutely, James. Very good morning to you. Thanks very much. And you started our ongoing coverage of the passing of Her Majesty by talking about inviting our listeners, didn't you, to share their memories of someone who's been so important and a constant in all of our lives, to remember her life, to remember her reign, to remember her legacy, to remember what we feel she stood for. And I just thought it might be nice, actually, as we see thousands of people continue to gather at all the main royal residences across the land, you know, their feelings this morning. And this just struck me, actually, in the past couple of minutes. There's a lady here in her 40s who's laid flowers at Buckingham Palace along with her dog, Bailey, Natalie Grimston. Now, the quote from her this morning, James, is, "It was just bizarre. It didn't seem real," as she heard about Her Majesty's death. "It's really what I've only ever known, the Queen," she says. "She was just somebody you didn't think was ever going to die." Now, that really struck me. And then she goes on to talk about, just in recent months, holding a Platinum Jubilee party in the cafe that she manages, and talking about the atmosphere then, celebrating the Queen's reign as we all did. I was with my team down on the Mall that day, and it was such a wonderful day. And of course, we were rewarded with seeing the Queen on the balcony, along with immediate members of her family. And that just struck me that tone, those comments must be, you know, how everybody's feeling this morning. I'm sure you still woke up this morning in a state of shock. I know I did. I got the bus in and it was really quiet.
Yes, it was quiet. It was quite normal on public transport this morning. There's that little moment, isn't there, where you don't remember, and then you do remember, and then somehow the enormity of the occasion of the moment hits you, and as your correspondent there said, that notion of it being different from everything that went before. I've often thought that every birth and every death feel unique, even though there have been millions of both throughout human existence. There's something about a birth when it's close to you that feels as if it is in some sense the first one ever. And similarly with a death, when you lose someone close to you, you feel things that you think no human could ever possibly have felt before, because they cut so deep, they run so far through you. And I think a lot of people, judging, as you say, by some of the commentary we're already hearing and some of the contributions being made by members of the public mourning at the gates of Balmoral or Buckingham Palace or Windsor, people are surprised by the depth of the shock that they feel at an event that everybody knew was coming. It is as if it had never happened before.
And of course, it's been a shock to our new government as well, hasn't it, James? And to a new Prime Minister who was going at pace into her new role, and it was suddenly cut. We know this morning there's been a meeting of Cabinet in the past few minutes. We know ministers have been leaving Number 10 following a meeting with Liz Truss. Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, Kemi Badenoch, for example, now International Trade Secretary, the first to leave, neither of them making any comment. As you said, proceedings are going to continue today in Parliament, that due to start at 12. Tributes are going to be paid to Her Majesty in Parliament and also the Lords. Now, we gather those tributes. That session could go on till about 10 o'clock tonight, and it's going to continue very unusually, but we are now in an unusual period.
Yes.
It's going to continue tomorrow as well. I can tell our listeners that at 1 o'clock here in London, we're going to have the very special gun salute. I can tell you that's going to be in Hyde Park and at the Tower of London, there are going to be 96 firings, of course, for each year of the Queen's life. We are also, meanwhile, while we're on air, now watching our screens intently. We know that King Charles III and Queen Consort, they spent their night overnight at Balmoral Castle last night. They are, though, set to return to London, James, sometime today, and then King Charles will be meeting the Duke of Norfolk, known as Earl Marshal. Now, he's in charge of what happens next, and that, of course, the accession and the Queen's funeral, and it's all going to be very carefully choreographed in the coming days.
We normally, at times like at times of immense national importance, have a sort of colleague that we can pull out of a distant cupboard and dust down for a reminder of what happened last time we were in similar territory. Or if not that, then a sort of collective memory, a muscle memory that the nation has. And we don't. It is, beyond a few people, a significant number of people, but a tiny minority of the population. It is completely uncharted waters, including, as you say, for the people charged with steering the nation through it. I'm struck by the pageantry and the almost Shakespearean echoes of a duke having control of the rigmarole, which I think is almost a technical term at times like this, and the offices that have these ancient titles, the nomenclature of royalty that is often just sort of bubbling away below the surface of our lives, and yet which now comes into its own. People like the Duke of Norfolk, again, spending much of their life in preparation for moments like this. And I think one of the things we must do today, Lisa, is, well, I can only speak for myself when I say educate myself. You may already be across all of the detail, but precisely what is meant by period of mourning, what we are expected to observe, what the time scale is now going to be for the ceremonies of state, for the gatherings, the masses, the coronations and the funerals that will now unfold. But I think we'll begin by crossing to Balmoral, which I mentioned a moment ago, and indeed shortly to Buckingham Palace, where people are gathering and where LBC's reporter, in the case of Balmoral, Alan Zaginski, is in situ. Alan, I suspect you're going to get asked several times in the coming days, and indeed you have been already, what exactly you're experiencing on the ground at Balmoral, where Her Majesty the Queen passed away yesterday afternoon.
Well, James, you mentioned the sense of personal loss that many across the country will be feeling, perhaps no more so than here in Aberdeenshire. Many people not only saw the Queen as their Queen, they also saw her as almost family, as a friend, because she spoke so highly of these parts of Scotland. It was said to be where she was happiest. It was said to be where she wanted to spend her final days. The mood here has been eerie at times. The rain has been pouring down around us as well. But it won't be long now until we see our King for the first time. When King Charles III leaves these gates with the Queen Consort to make his way to London, there's been a bit of a sudden frenzy of activity. Police have been moving barriers closer in. Their walkie-talkies are going off constantly now, and I've started seeing military trucks driving past for the first time. But as His Majesty would have been waking up inside the castle on the morning after the death of his mother here, people, some from nearby, others from further afield, were already down at these gates, adding their bouquets of flowers to the hundreds already there. And I did have a look at some of the messages, one that simply struck with me because it simply said, "Our Queen," and people were arriving as soon as dawn broke today, despite, as I mentioned, the rain, as they did last night. And I was here when the official announcement came through, James. Everybody fell silent. There was a real sense that we were witnessing not just a very sad moment, of course, but a historic one, the end of an era. And I spoke to some of those who came to pay their respects, and they told me the Queen was very much a constant.
We remember her when we was a child. We remember all interesting things about Queen's family, and we understand that it was a symbol of Great Britain and the symbol of the century, I should say.
Great leader of our country, sadly missed. She was a great representative for this area as well when she was here.
Now, I can tell you that Prince Harry has left Balmoral. He was in the back seat of a car, came out of these gates around 2 hours ago. We understand he's now on board a flight to Windsor to rejoin his wife. Of course, he arrived later than the rest of his family last night after that official announcement. But all the indications are the rest of the family are still inside the grounds at the moment. Reports they'll stay here for at least the rest of the day into tomorrow. But when they do leave, they'll pass through these crowds, head through the villages the Queen had such a love for, all of which have lowered the Union flag on every pole.
Alan Zaginski live at Balmoral. Many thanks indeed for your contributions this morning. I'm sure that won't be the last one. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. From Balmoral to Buckingham Palace, where Rachel Venables is waiting to talk to us. Rachel, one of the most powerful bits of broadcasting I heard yesterday was when our colleague, or it may even have been you, described that the gathered crowds at Buckingham Palace knew of the confirmation of Her Majesty's passing was the lowering of the flag. Andrew Marr last night talked of a shiver making its way down his spine simply at the words used to describe that moment, which must have resonated through the crowd in a unique fashion. And the crowd is still there, presumably some of them overnight.
Yeah, it was one of the most incredible moments I think I've ever witnessed and been a part of, and I felt that same shiver when one of the colleagues I was working with just gasped and pointed up to the Union flag that it always flies above Buckingham Palace. There is always a flag flying above Buckingham Palace, and it suddenly at 6:30 last night dropped to half-mast. And despite, the hours of wondering and waiting, we were here on standby, we knew that the Queen's health was poor, that she was under medical supervision. There was still that awful moment when you realised it had dropped, and the enormity of the moment really hit me, certainly personally, and I think it hit everyone in the crowd. There were gasps, many people fell silent, stopped talking, and everyone just stared and pointed at that flag, which is still at half-mast now. It will stay there, apart from a short break, as I understand it, when King Charles is proclaimed king tomorrow. It will stay at half-mast for long past her funeral in honour of the royal period of mourning. And the crowd here is absolutely huge. Even in the past, I think, 10 minutes or so, it has swelled, and the road around Buckingham Palace and up the steps towards the Victoria Memorial, towards the base of the Mall, completely packed with people who are all milling around. As you look to any of the straight roads that run here to the palace, you just see the stream of people coming forward, many of them holding the likes of flowers or cards, personal notes that they've written, and they're leaving them at the gates of Buckingham Palace, either these huge, extravagant, beautiful bouquets that are being placed down, or individual flowers just being placed sort of through the railings and propped there. And we've been speaking all morning to people who are here, all saying the same thing really. They spoke about the horror of the moment they realised what the Queen meant to them, whether they were ardent royalists or just normal people who just accepted her as a part of their lives and really suddenly feel a sense of loss that she's no longer there. Have a listen to this one woman. I think she perfectly encapsulates what everybody here has been saying today and yesterday.
I feel really sad. She's been part of my life since I was born, and I don't know what's going to happen next. She's just somebody that's been with us forever, it seems. And I thought she'd go on for a lot longer like her mother. So it's all a bit of a shock. She was British, she represented the UK, she represented us all, and she did it with such style. There was no edge to her. She was just a proper true royal.
Well, as I mentioned, the crowds here are growing by the minute, and I think this is going to be the scene here for weeks now. Buckingham Palace really is pulling people in. It's like a centre of gravity, both for the monarchy but also for the public, who've obviously chosen this as a spot to come to mark the moment and pay their respects. And it's also to hear, we understand, that King Charles will be heading at some point today. He's in Balmoral still, but of course duty calls, and he has awaiting him, amongst other things, a meeting with the Prime Minister, Liz Truss. We've got a new King and a new Prime Minister. She'll be meeting her here, we understand, at Buckingham Palace for their first address, and there's also going to be an address to the nation as well from our new King. We're expecting that to be broadcast at some point in the early evening.
Rachel Venables live from Buckingham Palace. Many thanks indeed. I'll share with you shortly details of how you can make your own tributes, floral tributes in particular, at any or all of the royal residences. Currently no physical books of condolence, but there is an online book of condolence. Again, I'll share the details of that with you shortly. I wonder whether you also respond confusedly to Rachel's use of the word King Charles. We heard them yesterday for the first time in the context of the current monarch, and yet I suspect for many of us it still conjures up images of the one of or both of the two previous holders of that title, and no guarantee, I learned, that he would actually be known as King Charles III. There was much speculation that he may adopt a different regal name. That's the sort of detail that LBC's royal editor Peter Hunt will be able to talk us through after the very latest headlines with Simon Conway.
Buckingham Palace has announced there will be a period of royal mourning for the Queen from now until 7 days after her funeral. People are leaving flowers and tributes outside the palace and other royal residences as the UK marks Her Majesty's death.
I feel really sad. She's been part of my life since I was born, and I don't know what's going to happen next. She's just somebody that's been with us forever, it seems.
Sad moment for the country, I think, that such a giant figure of unity in this country's no longer with us.
I think, like a lot of people, we all woke up this morning not wanting today to be today, and I just felt compelled really just to walk and have a bit of quiet time here.
At midday, bells will toll at churches across the country, and at the same time a special sitting of Parliament will begin for MPs and peers to pay tribute to Britain's longest reigning monarch. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, will lead the session in the House of Commons. 96 military gun salutes, one for each year of the Queen's life, will be fired at Hyde Park and other locations at 1 o'clock. The King is to return from Balmoral to London, and he will address the nation this evening. There'll also be a service of prayer and reflection on the death of the Queen in St Paul's Cathedral at 6 p.m. An online book of condolence has been opened on the royal family's website, allowing people from all over the world to send messages of support. And today's weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, more persistent rain for parts of Scotland, and a high of 21 degrees.
It's 10:32. Thank you very much, Simon. You're listening to James O'Brien and Lisa Aziz on LBC. We're broadcasting simultaneously across both of our stations, which is why I'm able to have the pleasure of Lisa's company, and she's able to have the somewhat more dubious pleasure of mine. Lisa.
James, thanks very much indeed. You went into the news there talking about how people could further perhaps put down their thoughts for the passing of Her Majesty, and we now know that books of condolence are being opened in churches, theatres, local authorities right across the country, as well as on the royal website. And the royal family's added that its book of condolence to the official website will allow people from all over the world to send messages of support. And as you said, there will be no physical books of condolence at any of the royal residences. I thought that might be nice for our listeners tuning our way to know. And of course, we can also speak with so many commentators and people who really knew the Queen quite intimately, have certainly covered her reign. And we are delighted to say that Peter Hunt's on the line, LBC's royal correspondent. Peter, good morning.
Good morning.
So good to have you with us. We're continuing to reflect on the legacy and the passing of Her Majesty. What are your thoughts this morning as the mourning period goes on? And we also start to get details emerging from Buckingham Palace and Downing Street about the timetable for the days ahead.
Well, in terms of the timetable, what we will see is this very careful choreography over the next 10 days, really, which will be trying to achieve two crucial aims. One, which is allowing our listeners and many other people in the UK and across the globe an opportunity to reflect, to mourn, to honour and to celebrate the passing of the Queen Elizabeth, probably the most famous woman on this planet. But aligned with that, there also has to be an opportunity, and what they have to try and this is the delicate balance, is introducing our next head of state, King Charles III, to us, and indeed Queen Camilla. I mean, those two words, Queen Camilla, some decades ago we would have thought that was an impossibility. That is now a reality. She will be crowned queen, as he will be crowned king at Charles III's coronation on an as yet unspecified date. But before we get to the coronation, we will have this process of mourning for the queen and this introduction to us of King Charles III, and that will start today after the church tolling of bells that you mentioned, the gun salutes, when first he has an audience with his first Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace, Liz Truss, and then a pre-recorded televised address to the nation, which is likely, I would have thought, to be broadcast around 6 p.m. this evening.
What do you think the tone of that address will be, Peter?
It will be the most important speech he has ever made. He is 73. It's a profoundly difficult moment for him. His mother has died, but in her death, he is now realizing his destiny. And he has to deliver a speech that absolutely captures what she meant to us, which has been captured in the people you have already been speaking to on your programme, and reassure those people about what he will provide to the nation. Because his greatest challenge is that over the coming days, as we increasingly focus on what we have lost, the concern for King Charles and his aides is that then puts into people's minds how big are the shoes he now has to fill.
Peter, it occurred to us earlier that we already know more about the opinions, the feelings, and even the private life of the new king than we did of the old queen, despite her 7 decades on the throne. How big a challenge will that pose, do you think, to King Charles? And how significant do you think it may be regarding the relationship between the monarch and the public?
I mean, that is his greatest challenge, because if we think of the Queen, I was very struck in your introduction where you were talking about how we knew her, but we didn't know her. And one of the people I've spoken to who knew her well said her greatest achievement was that we didn't know her, and she didn't overshare. She was an enigma, and it was being that enigma, that not oversharing, not being an addictive tweeter, is why she could perform this crucial role, which I think is what has really touched people and what people are talking to you about, this role of head of nation, this rallying figure in a time of trouble. And boy, have we had times of trouble in not recent months, recent years, recent decades. And it's that unifying figure. And King Charles's problem is we know a lot of what he thinks. And he's aware that that is a problem. So in the few interviews that he has done, because he's always resisted really talking about it, because in essence to talk about him as king means he has to talk about his mother dead. But in the few interviews he did do, he acknowledged that, and he tried to, and this will be what is fascinating in the coming months as to how he performs this role. We have to acknowledge he will be different. That is the reality, because we know so much about him. And I think what he will try and do, what he said he'll try and do, is use that power of being the head of state to convene people, this convening power as he describes it. But fundamentally, his life is now much more prescribed and restricted than it was as a Prince of Wales, and he knows he won't have those freedoms, but he potentially will find it difficult, because in essence what he now can do with the government of the day is to advise, to warn, and to be consulted, but all of that will have to be in private, not in public.
Indeed, it occurs to me as you speak that one of his greatest concerns, one of his greatest cause célèbre is the environment and associated matters for which he has been roundly mocked over the years. He's subsequently enjoyed resounding vindication in that field, and if anything, the cause is more urgent now than it was when he first started addressing it decades ago. Finally, Peter Hunt, if you would, a word on that title, still a little unfamiliar in all of our mouths, I think, King Charles. It wasn't written in stone that is the regal title he would take, I understand.
No, because if we go back to when the Queen became Queen, back in February 1952 in Kenya, in a game reserve, the first question that her private secretary said to her was, what name do you want to be known by? And she looked mildly perplexed and said, my own, of course, Elizabeth. And so that same first conversation will have been had between the then Prince of Wales becoming the king after his mother had died, yesterday afternoon, between him and his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton. And there was speculation in advance that he could have gone maybe for George, a sort of a link with his grandmother. He was particularly, his grandfather, King George VI, during the Second World War. He was particularly close to his grandmother, but he has chosen not to do that, and he has chosen, as we have been saying, to be King Charles III. And as I have already said, and that means we have Queen Camilla as well.
Just a question from a listener. The use of the word consort in Camilla's title, does that persist, or does that now get
I think it's an
jettisoned?
interesting use, I would say, and I think it is a deliberate use to help. I mean, this has been, I said earlier, didn't I, that it was once unthinkable. You know, if you think of the journey, to use that very modern phrase, that Camilla has been on, it's been a pretty extraordinary one, from, you know, Diana in that now discredited BBC Panorama interview talking about there being 3 people in our marriage, so it was a bit crowded, to the apocryphal and utterly made-up story of people throwing bread rolls at her in a car park at a supermarket, but we believed it even though it wasn't true, because that was the sense of public sentiment about her. So she's gone from that to marriage. But in all of that process, the institution has been very careful about public opinion. So even when she married in 2005, they made it clear it wasn't the intention then that she would be Queen and she might take a title of Princess Consort. Then at the start of the Jubilee this year, the Queen made it clear, yes, she wanted that to happen. And so I think they are inserting the word Queen Consort as a part of that ongoing preparation. But fundamentally, he is king, she is queen, and she also happens to be his consort. In the same way as the Queen Mother, as we knew her during the war, she was the queen and George was the king.
Peter Hunt, many thanks indeed for your time and, of course, for your expertise. We will no doubt be hearing more from Peter in the course of the day, quite possibly on this programme, which is a description I could apply to pretty much every contributor we will have today, including LBC's inimitable political editor, Theo Ushwood, who has some news.
To bring you up to date, of course, Liz Truss convened her cabinet at 9:30 this morning. It was a short cabinet lasting just half an hour, and she's expected in the Commons at midday. We're expecting the formalities in the Commons to take the form of a speech from Liz Truss, a statement from Liz Truss, followed up, of course, by Keir Starmer, and then a debate. Well, it won't be a debate as such, but it's called a debate right through until 10 p.m. This evening. And then, of course, the Parliament will reconvene tomorrow at 2 p.m. For further tributes to be paid to Her Majesty the Queen. There is going to be the opportunity tomorrow for senior members of the House of Commons to swear allegiance to King Charles. However, we understand that, and this is from a Speaker's statement, I'll quote it, all members will have the opportunity to take the oath when the House returns, although this is not a formal requirement. Now, of course, after tomorrow, Parliament will be suspended for the course of the period of national mourning. There is, however, some crucial legislation that needs to be passed, namely the emergency budget, which was announced yesterday, and there's some wrangling about whether Parliament can return or how it can return, so that legislation, which would underpin, of course, the help when it comes to the energy crisis, can be passed. Meanwhile, the Cabinet Office, James, has said that businesses and public services, well, for businesses at least, who want to observe the period of national mourning, it is discretionary. I'm quoting from the Cabinet Office advice. There is no obligation on organisations to suspend business during the national mourning period. Depending on the nature and location of their business and the tone of planned events, some businesses may wish to consider closing or postponing events, especially on the day of the state funeral. However, this is at the discretion of individual businesses. One final thing, James, just on sporting events. Again, it is up to individual organisations. I'm thinking here potentially of the Premier League, about whether they want to suspend games over the period of national mourning. But the Cabinet Office is saying that nothing should happen at the same time as the state funeral.
So it's left in the gift of the various organisations and institutions.
Discretionary up until the state funeral, and then it's quite clear from reading the advice in front of me that nothing should cut across that whatsoever.
Of course, and we don't yet know the date of that funeral, but we do know that the King has expressed a wish that a period of royal mourning be observed from now until 7 days after that as yet unspecified date of the funeral. We expect that to be confirmed in due course.
Yes, I'll bring updates to Sam.
Apropos precisely what Theo is talking about, the last night of the proms has been called off in the last few moments. You'll be aware that last night's scheduled concert was cancelled with about half an hour's notice at the Royal Albert Hall. To give you an indication of the significance of this decision, it's the first time that the last night of the proms has been cancelled since the Second World War. That's the final 2 concerts of the 8-week season due to go ahead both tonight and tomorrow have now been cancelled as a mark of respect for the Queen. I'm somewhat surprised to learn that those decisions are going to be left to the various institutions, but the more one thinks about it, the harder it would be to do otherwise.
Just one other line from the Cabinet Office. The statement, the guidance we've received says, as a mark of respect and in keeping with the tone of national mourning, organisers may wish to hold a period of silence and or to play the national anthem at the start of events or sporting fixtures, and players may wish to wear black armbands. So there is clearly the guidance from the government there is that we may see when the Premier League reconvenes, we don't know yet about, or other sporting events, of course, players donning national armbands or perhaps changing the markings of their team colours.
Theo Usherwood, many thanks indeed. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 10:45, joined for this morning and first hour of this afternoon by my colleague Lisa Aziz as well. We'll take some news headlines shortly, but before that, as promised, a little word on how you can perhaps make a more personal contribution to proceedings. The floral tributes following the death of Her Majesty the Queen are now being welcomed at various royal residences. At Buckingham Palace, you'll be guided to lay your tributes at dedicated sites in the Green Park or Hyde Park. Flowers left outside the gates of Buckingham Palace will be moved to the floral tribute garden in Green Park by the royal parks. I shall talk you through proceedings at the other royal residences after the very latest headlines with Simon Conway.
A period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral, in line with the King's wishes. Gun salutes to commemorate the Queen's life will be fired in central London this lunchtime, and bells will ring out at churches across the country at midday. King Charles III is due to return to London from Balmoral. He will address the nation this evening. A service of prayer and reflection on the death of the Queen will be held in St Paul's Cathedral at 6 p.m. LBC weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, a high of 21 degrees.
It's 10:46. Thank you, Simon. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. One of the reasons, Lisa Aziz, that you're here today is, I don't know whether they told you this, is to ensure that I resist my otherwise irresistible urge to talk about politics, whatever the circumstances may be. Today clearly is not a day for politics or indeed politicking, but I am delighted to invite onto the programme my next guest, Lord O'Donnell, Gus O'Donnell as was, former Cabinet Secretary and, of course, Head of the Home Civil Service. Lord O'Donnell, thank you so much for your time. Is it right to describe your former role as a form of bridge between monarch and government, among, of course, many other duties?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And for occasions like the one I remember most vividly, the coalition talks, I worked very closely with Christopher Guy, the Queen's Principal Private Secretary, in our ultimate goal of making sure that the Queen stayed above politics and wasn't dragged into being seen to have supported any particular party or any particular group of parties who might form a government. So, yeah, for me, she was the ultimate public servant. You know, she understood about service, and therefore she understood civil servants and public servants everywhere. So there was a big bond.
That notion of impartiality, very live at the moment in all sorts of areas, but with specific reference to the Queen, she's a wonderful example, possibly a paragon of how it doesn't mean uninterested.
No, absolutely. I keep saying about to civil servants, we can be, one of our core values is impartiality, but actually we can be passionate about delivering the best for the public. So it's completely different. I mean, when I talk to the Queen about public service, she got it. And after those coalition talks, she invited me and the late, great Jeremy Hayward to the palace for a lunch where we discussed these things. And she said to me, how can I show my appreciation for public servants? And I said, well, on the civil service side, come and meet all the permanent secretary colleagues. We meet every Wednesday. She came along. Then I said, well, look, we had these awards for civil servants where, civil servants from whole around the country, all grades, and she said, great, how can I help? She said, well, the venue would be good, Buckingham Palace. Yeah. She said,
come along, and then on the day she was there. She and Prince Philip both turned up. Stayed for I think 2 hours. I mean, it was amazing. To me, I'm full of praise, and she got what public service was all about. And look, who else would be doing their job 2 days before they died? She was there, saying goodbye to the outgoing Prime Minister and greeting the new one.
Yes.
I mean, that is amazing.
Well, and indicative, of course, of that notion of duty transcending absolutely every other aspect of her existence. If I overstep the mark, Gus, do slap me down. But did you form a sort of personal relationship with her? Did you get perhaps more of an idea of the woman behind the crown than the rest of us would ever get?
I wouldn't say it was particularly personal. I did. There were various occasions when we were closer. So, for example, I'd worked with John Major in the early days of trying to get Northern Ireland peace deal through. Tony Blair took that forward, Good Friday Agreement, we all know that. So when the Queen came to do that visit to Ireland in 2011, I mean, I went out as part of the pre-group, and I was there in Dublin Castle when she made that speech, starting off in Irish. That was an amazing trip. And one of the points that goes back to your point about the personal bit, one of the things she loved about going to Ireland was visiting loads of stud farms and talking about horses. Now, what I know about horses could be written on a postage stamp and it would still be empty. I knew nothing about that. So the personal bond, let's not overstate it, but it was very much about the service end. And I suppose the other bit was she was kind of like the therapist for prime ministers.
Okay.
Prime ministers would go along to their audiences of the Queen and they would come back, and what they would tell me about what happened was absolutely nothing, right? But they came back in a better state of mind. Basically, I think it was a mutual therapy session. They both, for once in their lives, could have a conversation with someone about anything and know it would never leak. That's very rare.
It's a remarkable thought, isn't it? Lisa Aziz is with me, Gus.
Gus, good to have you on the line. We know, of course, that from 12 tributes are going to be paid to Her Majesty, both in Parliament and the Lords. They're going to go on all day. They're going to continue tomorrow. Just thinking, with your level of experience, the arrangements have got these rather quaint code names like London Bridge and Operation Unicorn for what's happening just now in Scotland. As we enter now, though, this period of royal mourning, national mourning, I think the actual timetable for that yet to be determined. Give us a sense of the conversations, perhaps, that might be going on just now in the background between Buckingham Palace and indeed government officials ahead of the public knowing exactly what's going to happen in the coming days.
Well, the reality is, Operation London Bridge, of which Unicorn's a sub-part, really, has been around for a very long time. I saw versions of it and I left office back in 2011. So this has been well honed. It's been agreed with the palace, because remember, this is the Queen's funeral and memorial. And, her wishes, the family's wishes are absolutely important in all of this. And it's also obviously a government occasion because the memorial is a massive occasion. The lying in state is a massive occasion. There are security issues. You're going to have a concentration of world leaders coming to one place. You're going to have large numbers of people when the Queen lies in state. So, those are, from a security point of view, very difficult things to handle. So the plans are pretty much made. There'll be tweaks at the edges, no doubt. But, I mean, this is something which has been prepared for a very long time.
That said, if you were still in post, how significant would it be that the Prime Minister was barely out of the box, so to speak?
I mean, like I say, these plans have been around for a long time. I don't think it will make much difference. In the sense that, yes, a brand new Prime Minister, there's 101 things a brand new Prime Minister has to do, which I think we've all been concentrating on. And suddenly you're throwing in this as well. And of course, for a Prime Minister, it's challenging because you might have wanted to get on with getting legislation through Parliament. Well, Parliament's going to be suspended. We're going to do the tributes today and tomorrow, but then there's, a period when it's suspended. In D+10, as it's known, 10 days on, we'll have a memorial service. So, and of course, as a Prime Minister, you're greeting all those other heads of state and government. There might be bilaterals around that. So, yeah, it's an extra challenge for a new Prime Minister, undoubtedly, at a time when, as we all know, the country faces enormous challenges. So it is difficult.
Indeed, it does. Lord O'Donnell, former Cabinet Secretary, speaking of those challenges, you won't be surprised to learn there are a few other questions I'd quite like to ask you, but today is not the day. Lord O'Donnell, thank you. 10:55 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, joined for the duration by Lisa Aziz. Shall I run through those floral tributes that you are able to place yourself now? I told you about Buckingham Palace a moment ago. At Windsor Castle, you can leave your tributes at Cambridge Gate on the Long Walk. They'll be brought inside the castle every evening and placed on the castle chapter grass, which sits on the south side of St George's Chapel and Cambridge Drive. At the Sandringham Estate, members of the public are encouraged to leave floral tributes at the Norwich gates. At Balmoral, where we heard earlier, of course, from Alan Saczynski, the floral tributes can be left at the main gate. Holyrood House, you are encouraged to give floral tributes to the wardens at the entrance to the Queen's Gallery. They will be placed then on the forecourt grass, which sits in front of the north turret of the palace. And at Hillsborough Castle, floral tributes may be laid on the castle forecourt itself in front of the main gates. There will be information forthcoming, relevant in fact to the conversation we just had with the former Cabinet Secretary. There'll be information forthcoming from the Cabinet Office later today about the other public buildings and locations throughout the United Kingdom where you can lay your own floral tributes. And as we heard from Lisa earlier, that book of condolence online at the moment, although some of the physical ones are beginning to open, is at royal.co.uk/send-message-condolence. Remarkable to hear from a former Cabinet Secretary, because, Lisa, that's very much an insight into what's going on beneath the bonnet of public life, whether it's political or royal. The wheels are turning, one imagines, at breakneck speed at the moment.
As he said, they have been in place, these arrangements, London Bridge and Unicorn, for so long, and they have been obviously in the background, well rehearsed, James, as well. And we are heavily reliant, though, for us as broadcasters, very much on statements coming out of Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. On an occasion like this. I can tell you actually that we now know that Prince Harry departed Aberdeen at 10:20 this morning to return to London. We are, of course, all awaiting the arrival of King Charles III in London later on, where he indeed will be signing off, as it were, on the timetable for the days ahead. And from Buckingham Palace in the last hour or so, we got this statement. It is His Majesty the King's wish that a period of royal mourning be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. The date of the funeral, of course, we are also awaiting confirmation of. Now, royal mourning is to be observed by members of the royal family, royal household, staff and representatives of the royal household on official duties, together with troops committed to ceremonial duty. So that's come to us from Buckingham Palace. And of course, later this morning, James, we know that from 12, tributes are going to be paid in Parliament and in the Lords to Her Majesty from serving politicians. And then there will be those gun salutes at 1 o'clock in Hyde Park, and also at the Tower of London, that by the Honourable Artillery Company. And there will be one round fired for each year of the Queen's life.
Thank you, Lisa. As Theo told us earlier, it will lie in many ways with individual organisations and institutions to decide what to do about scheduled events. But as with the last night of the proms and tonight's scheduled concert at the Royal Albert Hall, so the football game between Norwich and Burnley in the Championship has been cancelled. The Premier League and Football League authorities are due to meet later today to make a decision on this weekend's matches. Racing due to take place today at Chester, Doncaster, Sandown and Salisbury have been cancelled. One can't help wondering what Her Majesty might have made of that decision, given her love of the turf. And similarly, there'll be no play at the BMW PGA Championship Golf at Wentworth or Stage 6 of the Tour of Britain cycling race. Interestingly, the RMT, the Rail Maritime and Transport Union, has announced that their planned strikes on the 15th and 17th of September will be cancelled. Not at this point postponed, but cancelled as a mark of respect. And similarly, the Transport Salaried Staffs Association has also called off planned strikes in September. Royal Mail workers, due to be on the second day of their postal strike today, have taken up tools once again, to coin a phrase. That action has also been cancelled as a mark of respect. And from one end of the musical spectrum perhaps to the other, we know already that the last night of the proms, scheduled to take place at the Royal Albert Hall on Saturday, is not going ahead. So to the Mercury Music Prize ceremony, which was due to take place today. I'm told that theatre performances are expected to continue while observing a minute's silence as a mark of respect. You're listening to James O'Brien and Lisa Aziz on LBC. Simon Conway is here with your headlines.
From Global's newsroom, the King has asked for a period of royal mourning to be observed until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. Her Majesty is expected to be laid to rest in around 10 days' time following her death at Balmoral yesterday. The new monarch is due to travel back to London from the Aberdeenshire castle. LBC's reporter Alan Zizinski is there.
It won't be long now until we see our King for the first time. When King Charles III leaves these gates with the Queen Consort to make his way to London, there's been a bit of a sudden frenzy of activity. Police have been moving barriers closer in. Their walkie-talkies are going off constantly now, and I've started seeing military trucks driving past for the first time. But as His Majesty would have been waking up inside the castle on the morning after the death of his mother here, people, some from nearby, others from further afield, were already down at these gates, adding their bouquets of flowers to the hundreds already there.
In an hour's time, bells will toll at churches across the country. At the same time, MPs and peers will gather at Parliament to pay tribute to Britain's longest reigning monarch. The session will continue until late tonight. These people have signed a book of condolence in Birmingham.
It's a big old shock. Sounds daft for a 50-year-old bloke to be upset about it so much, but it's just something you're so used to.
I just wrote to say thank you for being a comfort, a constant presence.
Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster Vincent Nichols says the Queen's unwavering faith in God would have helped her in her final hours.
Somebody who does that approaches death in a very particular way. They know that this is a step, a transition to the fullness of life in the presence of God, and reunited with her beloved Prince Philip.
Former Conservative MP Sir Nicholas Soames is the grandson of Sir Winston Churchill, the first Prime Minister to serve under Queen Elizabeth. He's told LBC Her Majesty was a fantastic communicator, even in times of national crisis.
I think for all of us, her Christmas address during COVID, the second go of COVID, when she said, "We will meet again, we will all meet again," was really so beautifully put and so deeply encouraging to people who'd had a perfectly dreadful time.
The Queen's death has been felt around the world. The presidents of America, China and Ukraine are among the many world leaders who've paid their respects. Royal Mail has confirmed stamps bearing the image of the Queen will remain valid following her death. And today's weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, more persistent rain for parts of Scotland, a high of 21 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Simon Conway.
It is 2 minutes past 11. I'm Lisa Aziz, alongside James O'Brien here on LBC. A reminder for you then of some of the new details coming through to us this morning. Buckingham Palace has announced a period of mourning for the royal family will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. Flags on royal buildings will stay at half-mast during that time. King Charles will discuss details of his mother's funeral when he arrives in London later. We are awaiting those details for when he leaves Aberdeen and arrives at RAF Northolt. He is set to address the nation this evening in a pre-recorded televised address. We know that a church service will be held at St Paul's Cathedral at 6 p.m. this evening, attended by the Prime Minister. There has been a cabinet meeting this morning. There's also been a shadow cabinet meeting. Tributes will be paid throughout today from noon in Parliament and the Lords through till 10 tonight, again tomorrow. Mourners continue to lay flowers and tributes across the country and at royal residences. Most major businesses, we were just discussing this with our political editor, including shops, entertainment venues, are opening as normal, though several sporting events have been called off out of respect alongside a number of strikes. The Queen's death has been felt around the world, of course, global leaders continuing to pay their respects overnight through this morning. US President Joe Biden said she was a stateswoman of unmatched dignity. Well, our own correspondent, LBC's Rachel Venables, looks back now at how much our country has changed during the Elizabethan age.
On the 2nd of June 1953, 27 million Brits crowded into neighbours' living rooms to watch a Queen be crowned, the start of the second Elizabethan age and the first ever must-watch TV moment at the dawn of mass media.
That was the moment when, for many, many of her citizens in Britain, they saw television for the first time.
Historian Sir Anthony Selden says it was a moment of optimism for a nation that had been to hell and back.
The country was still in the grip of the post-war depression, and rationing was still incredibly in evidence. It didn't finish for another couple of years. It was very much a greyer nation.
But many see the past 7 decades as ones of decline for Great Britain's influence. One of the defining moments, the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, formally ending our status as a world superpower.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities.
Britain lost a lot of face, a loss of credibility, a loss of moral power in the world, and it helped accelerate the gradual granting of independence to the British Empire.
Once the daughter of an emperor, by the end of her reign, the Queen was just trying to keep together her commonwealth of nations as we reckon with an ever more problematic past.
Britain's role in the empire had become much more controversial, widely criticised as being white privilege and exploitative.
Time has come to fully leave our colonial past behind. Barbadians want a Barbadian head of state.
With the 70s came a monumental moment, inclusion into the European common market.
The EU was doing well, Britain was not doing well, so pressure for Britain to enter the EU grew and grew. Britain joined on the 1st of January 1973.
Of course, our exit, then decades later, turned out to be just as monumental.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day!
In the 80s, Britain went to war.
After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday.
It did a little to restore Britain's pride in the world, and for a time, Britain, under Margaret Thatcher, became again a more significant power in the world, but only, this is the key point, in alliance with the United States.
Throughout this period, of course, from the 60s to the 90s, terror reigned with the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
A grenade was thrown, and then there was a massive explosion.
Flute band of West Belfast, complete with paramilitary spectacles.
The death toll in Northern Ireland in 1972 reached 467.
Here, the Queen famously put country before self when in 2012 she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, former commander of the IRA, the organisation that murdered her cousin, Lord Mountbatten.
A very historic sight, believe you me. The Queen shaking hands with Martin McGuinness.
Nationalism too has waxed and waned in all 4 nations throughout this era.
Shall be a Team Scotland to take this nation forward.
Scotland became steadily like a loose tooth, wobbling more and more in the jaw of the United Kingdom. Even Northern Ireland again became more uncertain.
But there's no doubt that the most seismic years of Elizabeth II's reign came at the very end.
To stay at home, protect our NHS and save lives.
One thing's for certain, for that new 27-year-old Queen, Great Britain today would have been almost unrecognisable.
No reign in British history since William I came to the throne in 1066, has seen as much transformation. The reason for that is partly that she was the longest serving monarch, but also that the pace of change has been so rapid.
9 minutes after 11, Rachel Venables there having a look at some of the significant changes, to say the very least, that have occurred during the 70 years during which Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II sat upon the throne of this country. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, joined this morning, delighted to be joined this morning by Lisa Aziz. And we cross now to another colleague who is working incredibly hard at this time, Alan Zaginski, on the ground at Balmoral, where the crowd presumably is going to be growing throughout the day. Alan, how would you describe the mood?
That's an interesting question, James. It's gone really from sadness and quite eerie, actually, last night and first thing this morning, to more one of joy, even in some people who have told me they're celebrating the Queen's life. Certainly some families with young children who've arrived with smiles on their face, and yes, they won't understand the gravity of the situation, but when I was speaking to them, they're well aware of who the Queen was, and there was even talk of her being like a grandmother to the country. But there are now very big crowds here. They're lining all the way along the bridge over the River Dee and out onto the road that I'm stood on the corner of just now, because it looks like we may be about to witness a historic moment here, our first glimpses of our new king for the very first time. The word on the ground here is that King Charles III will be leaving Balmoral very shortly with the Queen's consort to make his way to London. As I say, I'm stood on the corner of the road where we expect his motorcade to turn, unless of course he goes out a separate entrance. And there is a real frenzy of activity now. There's police waving traffic on, telling them not to stop. Barriers have been moved about. There's security guards dressed all in black with their earpieces in, starting to gather too. So as I say, I think we may be on the verge of seeing our king for the first time. But they have just had to shut the car park here actually as well, because as I say, so many people have been arriving to, of course, lay flowers, but also just to be together. And I actually just noticed a quite touching moment up on the hill here behind where the press are. Press from across the world have gathered. It was a small group of people who I've since found out are locals here. They live not too far around, about 5-10 minutes away, and they were all stood with their heads bowed beside a Lord Union flag outside the Crathy Kirk, and that's where Her Majesty will have attended services for decades. And I have been speaking to other people arriving here with their families, their friends. Some people have come from as far as England, and they told me why they wanted to be here.
It still doesn't feel real now because that's all we've ever known, and I'm sure King Charles will do a fine job, but the Queen, like I said, has been with everybody throughout their whole life.
Feels like a really historic moment. We were having dinner together and it just suddenly felt like, you know, actually this is a massive thing for our country. We've only ever known the Queen.
She's going to be very, very sadly missed, and it's like we all have a big void today, don't we?
And many of those people who have gathered here are very much hoping that the new king does drive past them, that they will be able to wave, maybe cheer as he does so. As I say, it seems like that may be imminent, and then he will be going to Aberdeen Airport, flying down to London.
And for that reason and others, Alan, we will no doubt be talking to you again today. Many thanks. Alan Zaginski there, live from Balmoral for LBC, 12 minutes after 11. Fraser Knight is at Windsor Castle, where, well, again, Fraser, I'm tempted to ask you the same question. We know the crowd will be growing throughout the day. Alan described a shift in mood, perhaps, a move from plaintive and mournful to perhaps celebratory and commemorative. What's happening at Windsor?
A very similar mood here as well, James. I've come round to the Long Walk, the gate on the Long Walk, one of those areas which have been designated for floral tributes. And I have to say there's a real sense of sort of community among people who've come here. I've been here since the early start of this morning. We've had, drips and drabs of people, but now there are hundreds of people who have just flocked in. The number of flowers being laid is really starting to increase as well. Now, of course, this is where the Queen made her home. Certainly in the latter years of her life, she stayed here fairly constantly. Many people who live in this town of Windsor tell me she was a neighbour, the town's grandmother as well. So there's lots and lots of tributes being paid here. And of course, the church bells in that chapel within Windsor Castle, where you'll remember the Queen laid her husband to rest just last year. The pictures of her sat alone in the chapel, really resonating with much of the public during those COVID restrictions. That will be where the Queen eventually is laid to rest too, alongside the Duke of Edinburgh. Now at 12 noon today, the church here as well as around the country joining them, they will ring out their bells for a full hour from 12 noon to pay tribute. And this morning, James, it was really touching actually. There was a point where there were some school kids who'd come by in their uniforms with their parents before going to school to lay the flowers here as well and to pay their respects. And here's what some of them had to say to me.
Remarkably emotional, really. Almost. I can't explain. It's probably more... I'm feeling more inside than when my father passed away. Yeah, I'm very emotional, actually. But I didn't realise I would be till I stood here.
We came here because we wanted to just put some flowers for the Queen, and yeah.
What did you like so much about the Queen?
Well, she was very kind, and she was still working it like 2 days ago.
How are you feeling this morning?
Sad, of course. Everyone's sad, but she had a fantastic life. She's got a fantastic family around her, really, in spite of all the, family stuff. And I think she probably had a good ending. But what more can you ask?
Now, James, you heard Alan say there that there are suggestions that King Charles could be about to leave Balmoral. Now, this morning we know that Prince Harry has already left. He was the first royal to leave there since the death of his grandmother. We understand he is on a plane from Aberdeen down to London and may even be on his way here to Windsor because, of course, his wife Meghan, along with Kate, the Duchess of Cambridge, and now Cornwall too, they stayed here with the children of Kate and William at their first day of school together yesterday. So a day to remember for them, as well as for so many people here for so many different reasons.
Thank you very much indeed, Fraser Knight, as you heard live from Windsor, where I imagine Her Majesty would have been amused to hear a little dog making its presence known in the background there. I can't tell you whether or not it was a corgi. 16 minutes after 11 is the time. Simon Conway is here now with your headlines.
The King has asked for a period of royal mourning to be observed until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. The new monarch is due to travel back to London from Balmoral and will address the nation this evening. At midday, church bells across the country will ring out to mark the Queen's death, and also this lunchtime gun salutes will be fired at London's Hyde Park and other locations. LBC weather, a mixture of sunny spells and showers, some heavy with hail and thunder, a high of 21 degrees.
Thank you very much, Simon Conway. It's 17 minutes after 11. Lisa Aziz and James O'Brien with you until 1 o'clock on LBC, at which time we're expecting a simultaneous gun salute to unfold. And my mind turns, Lisa, to the ceremonial now, from the historical, because we are going to be seeing some fairly epic events. No word yet specifically on when the funeral will be. The coronation, if it's not too early to mention that, traditionally occurs much, much later than many people will perhaps be expecting. Some I think 12 months after the funeral. But these are unique events. I know you've covered quite a few. I finally understand why my mother, when I was a kid, made an enormous fuss growing up about the fact that she had parked me in front of the television for the funeral of Edward VIII. Now, that would have occurred, I think, in May or June of 1972, and I was only born in January of that year. So I remember looking at Mum quite indulgently and thinking, what do you talk about? I get it now. She wanted me to know that I had that sort of link to British history. I had watched the funeral of the Duke of Windsor, as of course he became known. But the events that are now set to unfold are the like of which most of us have never seen before in our lives.
Epic and heavily detailed, James, and we know that they've had code names for many years. There is London Bridge underway here in Scotland. There is Operation Unicorn underway. lots of our eyes on screens just now, awaiting King Charles III to take off from Aberdeen Airport to make his way down to London. And then he's going to be meeting the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, who's actually in charge of the timetable ahead and the moments leading up to the Queen's funeral. We've yet to receive the official announcement of when exactly that will be. But yes, James, absolutely, to approve everything that is so carefully going to be choreographed, isn't it? We've already heard this morning from Buckingham Palace, and we are heavily reliant on these official statements just now under those various code names. It's the King's wish that the period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. The funeral date still to be announced, of course. We've just had some more statements coming through in regards to what's happening in Scotland. On Sunday, for example, we're expecting the Queen's coffin to depart Balmoral for Holyrood. On Monday, King Charles will be heading back to Edinburgh Airport. He's going to be taking part in a ceremony of the keys at Holyrood. The Queen's coffin, we're told then, will be moved from Holyrood to St Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, where it's going to rest for 24 hours. There's going to be a motion of condolence in the Scottish Parliament. And then on Tuesday, we gather, King Charles will be heading to Belfast.
It's funny, I can't hear mention of the Duke of Cornwall, which is a title that now, I think, falls to Prince William, without thinking of the very first line of King Lear, when Kent strolls onto the stage and they're looking at the map that's about to be carved up between Lear's daughters, and Kent says, I think, I thought the King had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. And Kent goes on to warn that the King of France is planning an imminent invasion of the country. France, of course, no longer has a king. But it does have Emmanuel Macron, who has just delivered a new tribute to Her Majesty the Queen.
Dear citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, aujourd'hui, nous sommes tellement tristes. It is with great sorrow that the French people have learned of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Her wisdom and empathy have helped us all to steer a path through the historic ups and downs of the last 7 decades. With her passing, we all feel an emptiness. Millions of people around the world discovered the images of her coronation and were immediately captivated by the young leader who already exhibited such strength and courage. The courage of a life marked by the war, and soon the courage to uphold, from one century to the next, the values of freedom and tenacity. Her rare and powerful words, her unwavering dignity, made her the constant symbol of the United Kingdom. We are grateful for her deep affection for France. Elizabeth II mastered our language, loved our culture, and touched our hearts. From her coronation on, she knew and spoke with all of our presidents. No other country had the privilege of welcoming her as many times as we did. In her, I have known a great head of state, a unique example of her devotion to her people, and a very close ally. With her, France and the United Kingdom shared not just an entente cordiale, but a warm, sincere, and loyal partnership. To you, she was your queen. To us, she was the queen. To us all, she would be with us forever. We will remember and perpetuate the values she never ceased to embody and promote, the moral fortitude of democracy and freedom. At this sad moment, we send our heartfelt condolences to His Majesty the King, the royal family, the British people, and all those who loved the Queen and will miss her so deeply. Nous sommes avec vous.
The French president Peter Allen is LBC's correspondent in Paris and joins me now. Peter, you've lived there for many years. I wonder if you would begin with a word directed at people surprised by both the tone and the profundity of that tribute from Emmanuel Macron. Rarely has the entente sounded quite so cordial.
Absolutely, James. France may be a republic. It got rid of its last queen in rather violent circumstances in 1793, but the outpouring of love and respect for Elizabeth II here this morning is absolutely extraordinary.
Gosh.
President Emmanuel Macron hasn't stopped releasing tributes to Elizabeth II. He says she represented a sense of eternity, was one of the great giants of the 20th century. That's not just a 44-year-old French Republican speaking. Anybody would think that's surprising in itself, that somebody of his generation would be speaking like that. That's been reflected right across the French media, who are talking to people across the Republic about Elizabeth II. She was somebody who spoke French very, very well. She first visited Paris as a 22-year-old princess in May 1948, along with Prince Philip, and they received Légion d'honneurs then for their efforts during the Second World War. Then she completed 6 state visits here. I think that's the most state visit she visited anywhere. And every single time she was honoured and celebrated, as much as she's being honoured and celebrated today following her death, James.
Indeed, you've had a foot, Peter, in both countries for most of your working life. Are you surprised personally by the quantity and quality of coverage and response?
In some ways, yes. Clearly, because I am working now in a republic that believes passionately in Republican ideals. It's a country, again, that rejected its royals in the 1789 revolution. It executed its king and its queen then. So in that respect, yes, extremely surprised. But when you look at the queen as a constitutional monarch, she wasn't part of the ancient regime, as it's referred to here. She was somebody who presided over a period of decolonization, of democracy in Britain. She was somebody who massively respected the values of France and the values of Britain. So in that respect, I'm not surprised at all, James.
We are, as you'll understand, studiously avoiding the political on the programme this morning, but I'm glancing at a projection of a Union flag onto a state building in Gdansk in Poland. I'm reading about the broadcasts in Germany being interrupted to announce the Queen's death. A Dutch commercial radio station yesterday also interrupting their programming to break the news. It's a wonderful illustration, Peter Allen, of the conflation of monarch and country, isn't it? I think the affection being displayed for the Queen is in many ways a surrogate for affection felt towards this country, an affection that perhaps would surprise many of the people living here in recent years.
Absolutely right. I'm standing by the Élysée Palace, the presidential palace right in the heart of Paris. I can see the Union Jack taking pride of place next to the tricolour of France and the EU flag. And a few doors along, I can see the British Embassy, and there's a huge, great picture, a smiling picture of Elizabeth II, and the reverence with which Britain, not just the memory of Elizabeth II is being greeted at this moment, is quite extraordinary. It's been made very clear at the Élysée Palace this morning that they are flying the Union Jack and putting it in pride of place, not just as a mark of respect for Elizabeth II, but also to the British people, to the British nation. So, as you say, this remarkable woman has come to personify the British state, and the French people see it as a chance to think about her memory and honour her memory, while also honouring a fine ally.
Peter Allen, it's Lisa Aziz here alongside James O'Brien, and you've been reflecting on how the French media there and broadcasters have been announcing this news, reflecting on the Queen's legacy. I can tell you our papers here, we've got some wonderful images across every single front page, haven't we, James, of images of the Queen from her youth, from her later years. Front of the Mirror, for example, a wonderful image and a simple thank you. Front of the Telegraph, grief is the price we pay for love. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, with an image from her younger life. Fair to say we last saw Her Majesty, actively as it was, last summer at the G7 Heads of State gathering in Cornwall. And she was seen very much, I remember the images of her laughing and being very cordial, very happy in the company of French President Emmanuel Macron. She was, of course, a fine French speaker, and they did appear to get on.
They got on extremely well. And of course, the Queen met lots and lots of and worked with lots of different prime ministers in Britain. She also worked and spoke to lots of presidents and indeed prime ministers here in France. She was with Charles de Gaulle. She was with Georges Pompidou. She was, of course, with Emmanuel Macron at numerous official occasions. So that kind of sense of continuity that the British people have been very, very aware of, and very aware of the fact that the Queen represents, has also been prevalent here in France. The French people associated her with all kinds of periods of French history, starting with the immediate post-war period when she came over in 1948, just as France was trying to rebuild itself, just 4 years after Nazi occupation. She was in Paris with her husband, a naval officer, Prince Philip, and they were honoured by the French Republic then. And again, this covers all the periods all the way through, right up until 1994, for example, when she was on the Eurostar that came over from Britain for the first time underneath the Channel Tunnel. She was Francois Mitterrand. So you've got all these incredible points in Anglo-French history, which the Queen was a part of. And as you say, Lisa, all the while speaking French extremely well.
Có người lặng lẽ ngồi buồn, biển chiều hoang vắng, mây